And it's only in the 11th century manuscript that we see Cresfonta, that we have the variant that puts this fragment with a different myth and with a different story. As such, most editors have subscribed to the view that this fragment would be from Ennius Thyestes and would be a reference to Thesprotus, the king of Sicyon, where Thyestes is departed to rape Pelopeia and to father Aegisthus. We see this in Kaplan's Loeb, in Accard's Boudet edition, and it's suggested as well that in the 11th century manuscript where this variant comes in, this corruption could be because the preceding section, so the section before the reference to Ennius, references Cresfontes. So there's a kind of mix-up of the text before leading into the text afterwards as well. Okay, so far, so safe. We've looked at tragic fragments with a tragic tone. They bring up clear themes of the role of the divine and the role of ancestral guilt that we would expect of a tragedy. However, when reading through Cicero's different works, when looking beyond his treatises on rhetoric, when looking beyond his treatises on philosophy, we find fragments that don't perhaps fit the tradition in quite the same way. So, if we could turn our attention now to point 4 on your handout, and take a little look at how Cicero repeatedly references a dramatic fragment in his letters. Okay, a little bit of context then. Unfortunately, jokes are never funny when you have to explain them, but I think Cicero's joke needs a little bit of explanation. So, Cicero creates a pun on the name of Pelops, and this really merges the mythical role of Pelops, Thyestes' father, and the contemporary politician Pelops of Byzantium, with whom Cicero has a particular quarrel. And we learn about this in point 4a on your handout, where Plutarch tells us this is almost the only one of Cicero's Greek letters. There is also a second addressed to Pelops of Byzantium, which was written in a spirit of anger, and Gorgias Cicero properly rebukes as if he was thought to be worthless and intemperate. But towards Pelops, Cicero shows a mean and querulous spirit for having neglected to obtain for him certain honorary decrees from the Byzantians. So Cicero has a particular quarrel with Pelops of Byzantium, and for this reason, he uses what I believe to be a dramatic refrain to joke about the state of Rome with Pelops in mind. The joke perhaps works on 2 levels, because we have Pelops' line is referred to, suggesting the mythological family, perhaps also suggesting the followers of Pelops of Byzantium. But we perhaps also have the theme of alienation, because Pelops in the mythological tradition is Phrygian, as I think we discussed yesterday, and Pelops of Byzantium is distant, is a Byzantine. So let's have a look at how this fragment works in the letters. So this should be point B on your handout. And we see, from Cicero to Curious greetings, and we have a discussion on leaving Rome, effectively. I no longer urge you or ask you to come home. On the contrary, I am anxious to take wing myself and go to some place where never more of Pelops' line I'll hear the name or deeds. You cannot imagine the sense of personal dishonour I feel at leaving the Rome of today. Poor Curious, he hears the same joke twice. And we see this again later on in Letters to Friends, from Cicero to Curious greetings. However, what you have done and were free to do by locomotion, that is, to live where never more of Pelops' line, you know how it goes on. I am achieving more or less in a different way. Cicero is very aware that this is a quote that he is appropriating. He's very aware that he's repeating himself. And he uses this quote in a very candid way as sort of a byword for the degeneration of Rome, in the same way that we see degeneration in the house of Atreus. So, let's take a look at how this works also in Letters to Atticus, and we see that the usage is very much the same. When speaking to Atticus, Cicero tells us, they have won eternal glory and happiness too in the consciousness of what they did. But for us, if I am not mistaken, there is only humiliation ahead. So I long to be away where never more of Pelops' line, as the poet says. One more time for the cheap seats at the back, as we say in the UK. We have this in Letters to Atticus. Hence, though I had no doubts before, point E on your handout, I am now all the more determined to fly from here, and as soon as I possibly can, whenever more of Pelops' line I'll hear the deeds or fame. So we have perhaps a fairly weak joke putting on the name of Pelops, but if we take this away from comedy in terms of what is funny, and think about comedy in terms of genre, we perhaps also have Cicero presenting this quote as a comic refrain. When we hear this joke again and again, we get the sense of here we are again in the state of Rome. It's very candid, and it seems to pertain to the kind of refrain you would expect from a comedy. So this changed my expectations of quotation in Cicero, and it changed my question, really. Rather than thinking about how trends in Cicero's quotations can help us attribute unattributed fragments to either Ennius, Thyestes or Accius, Atreus, this made me think, should we limit the Thyestean fragments Cicero cites to Ennius, Thyestes and Accius, Atreus? When presented with mythological content, must we always look to tragedy? Or could it be possible that we're finding the Thyestes myth in a new theatrical genre? And this is where I return to Pomponius Mononensis, who we mentioned in the first slide of the presentation, who seems to have written an Attilaean farce on Atreus. Now, we know that Cicero is aware of farce. He seems to mention it in connection with tragedy, and he seems to suggest in letters to Atticus that farce was the typical genre to follow up a tragedy, where he suggests here, I see you follow up Accius or Eunomaus with a mime instead of a farce. That suggests that farce was the standard follow-up, the standard comic complement to tragedy, and might even suggest that farce could include mythological material in the same way that satyr plays did for the Greeks. We have one fragment of Pomponius Atreus, and we have a problem with where we position it. We have a reference to the children in Pomponius Atreus, and the problem that we're faced with when we get this material is that we have a Pomponius Secundus. We have an imperial tragedian who also wrote an Atreus. So when faced with these fragments, unless we have a clear description of which Pomponius, it's very, very hard to position it either in tragedy or in farce. Nonetheless, I think that the way Cicero presents this quotation in this fragment, to me, suggests a comic genre and suggests the kind of levity we would expect from farce. We do know that Pomponius Mononensis wrote an Atreus. We have a testimony to suggest that. So should we default to tragedy when presented with such mythological material? Or could we consider perhaps how the Thyestes and Atreus story could be told in a comedy, particularly because farce presents very fruitful stock characters, such as Macus, who I've provided on the PowerPoint, the comic glutton, and we can only imagine how Thyestes would fit that role. So the challenge then would be to discover if and how Cicero uses comedy in his discourses. Is it something that Cicero would be likely to quote if it was available? And this brings us to point F on your handout. So what Cicero seems to do in his other works, in Natura Deorum for example, is very much differentiate mythological tragedy from contemporary everyday settings of comedy. And this is a problem because we don't have a paradigm for mythological comedy in Cicero. So on point F of your handout, Cicero tells us, we alluded just now to Medea and Atreus, characters of heroic legend, planning their atrocious crimes with a cool calculation of profit and loss. But what of the frivolous scenes of comedy? Examples of the abuse of reason from comedy. Do not these show the reasoning faculty consistently employed? Therefore, we see Cicero understands the merits of comedy and the merits of using it to execute a point, but perhaps not quite, perhaps we don't have quite such an insight into the mythological comedies and how Cicero would have used those. If we look again at De Oratore, we have a reference to the use of comedy and rhetoric here, and how comedy can be used to construct an argument. Perhaps a tongue-in-cheek reference to Caesar suggests that in contemporary politics in Rome, comedy can be used to lighten the mood despite the sort of circumstances around us, and it can be an effective way of presenting an argument. So if we go to point F on your handout, has not our friend Caesar contributed quite a novel method of oratory and introduced a style that is almost unique? Whoever, besides Caesar, handled tragic themes in a manner almost proper to comedy, gloomy topics light-heartedly, severe ones cheerfully, and the business of the courts with a charm suggestive of the stage. So we're not just looking at humour, we're looking at the generic expectations of comedy on stage. And this, without allowing the importance of the subject to preclude a jest, or the touches of humour to impair the dignity of the style. And finally, again in De Oratore, we have a reference to the way an orator could incorporate jokes and use jokes and humour effectively, which may suggest that Cicero does look to comedy when presenting a case or argument. And this is the final point on your handout. Then there are jokes which are somewhat absurd, farcical jests, but for that very reason often comical, and which are appropriate not only to actors in farce, but also in some degree to us orators. And we have the example of the silly man. As soon as he was going rich, he died. And if we just jump to the bottom, we can see Cicero's description of these kinds of jokes. A jest of this sort is rather trivial and assumes simplicity, as I said, fit for farces. But now and then, even we orators find room for them, with the result that even a man who is no fool says something in the manner of a fool, but not without humour. Therefore, hopefully we've seen that throughout Cicero's quotations, he changes the way he deploys dramatic quotes depending on the tone of his text and the sort of narrator he is presenting himself as. In the Tora Deorum, we have a very philosophical focus on the role of ancestral guilt that I suggest best befits the Atreus narrative and that is securely attributed to Accius. In his works on rhetoric, Cicero refers very explicitly to the construction of an argument, again picking up on a theme that seems to fit the narrative of Thesprotus, that seems to fit the story of Thyestes in Sicyon. In his letters and in his epistolary works, we have a more confused picture. We have the use of what seems to be a dramatic quote as a joke, but what's more, as a comic refrain that punctuates the letters. Now, we see this as readers of the letters as a collection, but it would also be apparent to the intended recipients because he uses them multiple times for Curius and for Atticus as well. So, in summary, we've hopefully, by looking at the unattributed fragments, built up perhaps a bigger picture of what may have been part of the Thyestean tradition. We've seen perhaps the role of the gods and the role of ancestral guilt in the Republican tragedies, which offsets the very political focus of the fragments and the way that they are transmitted. But we've perhaps also seen evidence of this horrible cannibalistic story in a comedic tradition, which I would suggest perhaps encourages to reread Seneca's Thyestes in a different way. On your handout, I've included a bibliography, and Gareth Meltzer makes a very interesting case for dark wit and black humour in Seneca's Thyestes, which many people seem to have an issue with, seem to think is particularly grotesque. However, I would suggest there is a clear precedent for a humorous rendition of the Thyestean feast, and I would suggest also that this is potentially evident in Cicero's comic refrains. Thank you.